So this is going to be super difficult because, as with anything to do with Israel, there's a lot of historical revisionism on both sides. And there's a lot of just uncertainty because records weren't always accurate during this time period because everything was in a complete state of chaos. And like I said, it's historians tend to take one side or the other to the point of just yeah, of it getting out of control. So let's start with the Balfour Declaration. So last time we talked about there being kind of two major strands in Zionism: revisionist and labor, or practical and political. So the practical Zionists, once again, didn't really care about a Jewish state per se. They just wanted to move en masse to Israel. Or I guess kind of individually move en masse, if that makes any sense. And the revisionist goal was to get an Israeli state, and that was viewed as a higher possibility. So what eventually the revisionists came up with, and let me just find it, is the founder of revisionist Zionism. I can't pronounce that. Jabotinsky came up with the idea of the evacuation plan. He said, okay, what we're going to do is we're just going to take all the Jews in Europe, starting with Eastern Europe, and we're all going to move to the Middle East. We're all going to move to Palestine, and once we're a majority there, our whole thing will start. Our state will just kind of be established. And this especially came about in the aftermath of World War II, where you started to have the emergence of fascism and anti-Semitism going really kind of rampant throughout Eastern Europe, especially with kind of the foundation of Nazism and it being very explicitly anti-Semitic, as was the regimes in Romania and in Hungary and all those kind of things. So during the 1920s and 30s, you had the British in kind of an impossible situation where they had to deal with the fact that most of their Middle Eastern territories were Arab, but the Jews held significant political power in both Britain and in America, particularly in America. And they had to kind of balance the interests of these two groups. And it just proved exceedingly difficult. So kind of one of the areas that started all of this was the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration happened during World War One, and it was the memorandum basically was that Her Majesty's government would look on with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So it was very vague. It didn't say Jewish state, it said Jewish homeland. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean a Jewish state? Does that mean just a multi-ethnic state where the Jews can come? Does that mean some Jews can immigrate? Does that mean all the Jews can immigrate? No one was really sure. To a large extent, it was kind of a cynical political motive. I mean, you had British Israelism, and you had a lot of millenarian Christians who felt the reestablishment of Israel was a necessary condition for the overthrow of the end times to come about. But in this case, most people think it's more of a cynical political one. So it had three kind of major ideas that they were hoping to accomplish. The first is with the Russian Revolution, well, if we know a lot of the major leaders were Jewish, like Trotsky, or part Jewish, like Lenin. So they thought if we implement the Balfour Declaration, we promise the creation of Jewish homeland, Russia will stay in the war. Because the Allies really needed Russia with its limitless manpower and resources to stay in and keep the German army divided on two fronts. So they thought, okay, if we give the Jews this, then they'll be willing to continue supporting it. The other thing is because the Jews had such a large influence in America, they figured if we could appease them, then they'll rally in support of the war. They'll get America to give us more money and commit more strongly to the war effort. And the other one is Jews held a lot of influence and economic power in Germany, and they felt this would undermine the support of the Jews for Kaiser Wilhelm. So this seemed to work, and Jewish organizations in America immediately started to lobby Congress for a much larger role in the war. And who knows how much of a net effect this actually had, but it dramatically changed how Zionism was viewed. It kind of went from being a fringe movement. I mean, we have here, it went from, in America, 7,500 official Zionists to, let's see here, like 20 times that in the span of 5 years. So Zionism became a much more mainstream ideal within the Jewish community. And as soon as World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire was no longer controlling the area. The British now controlled it as Mandate Palestine. Mandate meaning it was eventually expected to become independent, maybe unlike some other British colonies, which they were going to make more of an effort to hang on to. So during the 20s and stuff, Jews started to move en masse to Mandate Palestine. Because at the time, the Jews were, I think, like 5 to 10% of Palestine's population. Palestine just being the whole area of modern day Israel and Palestine. So they start to move en masse. The issue is that caused revolts throughout the Arab world. Because keep in mind, the British also controlled Egypt. I believe they controlled Libya. The French controlled Syria. The British controlled Iraq, Jordan, to a certain extent Yemen, like Aden, the Suez Canal. They control all these important things, so relatively speaking, the Arabs were more important, but the Jews were kind of more united. So the British kept trying to detain Jewish immigrants, and they put a lot of them on Mauritius or Cyprus, but more and more kept getting in. And it just became a large expense on Britain, and it kind of wore them down over time. I think eventually, by the time you get to post-World War II, Britain was exhausted, and they were tired of spent the amount of money and manpower they were putting into an economically worthless territory. So that's kind of what happened. So let's move on. So we have the foundation of kind of some of the main Israeli militias. So we have the foundation of Beitar, and let me see where did I put the other one. There's Beitar and there's Irgun. So you have kind of these revisionist Zionist organizations that start up, and their kind of ideal was to provide eventually a military force for a new state of Israel. So kind of throughout the 30s, and particularly once we get into the 40s, you have these right-wing militia groups starting to emerge throughout the Jewish world, moving to Israel, and they immediately began carrying out attacks against the British occupation forces and just trying to agitate. The idea being that the British didn't really care that much about this territory, so if they were able to do enough damage, eventually the British would just get pissed off and leave. Which is more or less what happened after the events of World War II. So eventually we keep going kind of on this path with more and more illegal immigrants arriving, particularly once World War II and deportations and other events around the Holocaust started to happen. More and more people continued to go in. So Irgun kind of began in earnest to raise up the kind of the level of their warfare against the British. So there was a number of different affairs the British, which eventually culminated in the King David Hotel bombing, in which they blew up the King David Hotel, which was the administrative headquarters within Palestine. Now, there's a lot of kind of controversy over this. Irgun claims that they sent phone calls to the King David Hotel saying we're going to blow the building up, get everybody out, but they were ignored or they might not have happened. There's a lot of different theories as to this, but they wound up blowing up the building with people still in it, and it killed 91 people. And the British kind of started carrying out a bigger suppression campaign around that time period. But like I said, throughout World War II, you had Jewish groups coming in, you had a couple different Arab revolts, and the more the Jewish groups came in, the more the British were incapable of restraining immigration, the angrier the Arabs got, and the more both sides attacked each other and the British. So eventually, kind of in the aftermath of World War II, you have, once again, a much larger wave of Jewish immigration coming. And by this point in time, the British government really wasn't sure what they were going to do with the whole thing. So there was a bunch of different plans put forward. One was to have a federal state that composed both the Jews and the Arabs. The other was partition. There was one proposal that Jerusalem, because of its important character, would be put under an international occupation force and be an international city. So basically, what eventually happened is Britain was very much influenced by the United States with its powerful Jewish lobby, and they said, we're going to not grant you some of your reconstruction loans you need unless you allow more Jewish immigrants in and you give independence to the Jewish state in Israel. So the whole thing, like I said, is just a mess. I'm even having trouble explaining it. And I've read a couple books about this. It's really complicated. If you want to go through all the attacks the Jews made, all the attacks the Arabs made, all the political maneuvering the British failed at, basically the British were just tired of the whole situation and they offloaded it onto the UN, which led to the UN voting on the partition plan, which is eventually this, which came about, which I think had absolutely like 0% chance of ever working. Because look how like bad that this is. You have all these like super narrow strips. Like, look at this. It doesn't even look aesthetically presentable. There's no way that this was ever going to hold. Also, the Arabs, I think, to a large extent correctly, were like, look, we've been the overwhelming majority here for the last, like, 1,600 years, and all these guys just show up, and they started to kind of kick the Arabs out, and a lot of Arabs fled. And the whole thing was just never going to work. So when Israel declared its independence, interestingly, what you had was the Soviet Union immediately recognized them. The Soviet Union was actually the first country to recognize Israeli independence. They were the first country to legally recognize it, although America de facto recognized it earlier. So the Soviet Union thought that Israel would become a socialist state, that they'd become a communist ally within the Middle East. And once again, if you look at Mapai's logo, it's very obviously a hammer and a sickle. So early Israel was very socialist, and early Israel was very much on the whole thing that they'd be an ally to the Soviet Union. Now, the reason the Soviets supported it were mainly because they thought that Palestine becoming independent would lead to a destabilization of the British Empire in the Middle East and would hasten kind of the destruction of Great Britain, which is something obviously they wanted, as Great Britain was one of the great powers, and it would make the United States a bit more isolated during the Cold War. The Russians also saw a lot of opportunity to move into kind of these colonial areas that had, well, these areas that had previously been colonial, but now were completely kind of up for grabs. So they backed Israeli independence, and once we have Israeli independence, we immediately have two Israeli-Arab wars. We have the Palestine War, which I really don't know much about, which is kind of the first phase of the war. And then we reach the second phase of the war, which I know a little bit more about, which is the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So interestingly, during this phase, the Arab League didn't really have that much in the way of weaponry. However, the United States, I believe Great Britain, and most importantly the Soviet Union, provided a lot of arms shipments. In fact, what kind of proved decisive was the Soviet Union had its Eastern European allies like Czechoslovakia sell or send large numbers of weapons to what became the IDF. So I think it's about time now to talk a little bit about why the Arabs sucked so much. And there's been other videos about this on the internet, on YouTube, as to why the Arab armies continually fail, despite the fact that they theoretically can raise much larger armies than the Israelis, because they got utterly devastated in this war. And once we get to the 6-Day War, the 6-Day War was a joke. It's one of the most just lopsided, embarrassing military defeats in history. So, first and foremost, there's the issue of logistics and organization. I forget who it was who said a novice studies strategy and expert studies logistics. Basically, the Arab countries are incapable of getting it together when it comes to these wars. They aren't able to field an army that they theoretically should be able to field because they're not able to get their supply chains down. They never really figured out how to equip everybody, to make sure they get fed, to make sure they get ammunition, to make sure that they have the spare parts, etc. Because logistics are extremely important in war. If your troops don't have food and they don't have bullets, they're completely useless. So the Jews have always been much, much, much better at it. So despite the fact that they're facing enemies with much larger population, the actual number of troops these countries can raise are very tiny relative to their overall size, whereas Israel has a much better, well, just logistical situation because they're fighting so close to their supply depots and to their heartland. But beyond that, they're just much better at managing things. So they can mobilize a much, much larger percentage of their population. So they often will outnumber the Arabs throughout the various wars that you have just because they have conscription and they're able to kind of carry it out. While there was widespread hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism in the Arab world, that's not doesn't really compete with the Jewish perception, which I would agree with, that they're literally fighting for their existence as a people and for their national homeland. There wasn't really a threat at any point that the Arab countries were going to be completely annexed by Israel and they were going to be driven into the sea. At maximum, the Israelis were going to take basically what the borders of Israel are today. Yeah, they were going to take basically, like I said, what the borders of Israel were today, and there was never really a threat of the Arab countries getting wiped out. There's also the issue of, I don't know, they just don't feel like fighting that long. They whatever in their character, by this point in history, they just break very easily, they retreat very easily. And with the exception of the Jordanian army, which tends to perform a little better, in general, they're just kind of very low morale soldiers. There's also the issue the Arabs have an extremely autocratic command structure where there's a lot of paranoia, to some extent justifiably, where different levels of the army will actively conceal information from each other. So, like something that happened during the Six-Day War is the Egyptians would frequently cut communications off between various army groups because they feared if they learned what the actual situation was, they'd run away. So throughout the Six-Day War, Nasser was under the impression that the Israeli Air Force had been completely destroyed and they had air superiority, and he made strategic decisions based on this. They destroyed, I think, the radios of some of the field armies so that they couldn't learn how bad the situation was. And the problem with this, of course, is if you don't have intelligence, if you have no idea what's going on, you don't know how to react to stuff. So there's consistently poor communication. Officers take virtually no initiative. Like one of the things that happened when, I believe it was an airbase in Cairo was being bombed, was due to kind of incompetence and a lack of initiative, all the AA guns were unloaded and the ammo was locked up. So one guy had the initiative to go unlock the ammo, load a gun, and start shooting at the Israeli jets, and he was afraid that he was going to be court-martialed and killed for disobeying orders. So people were so afraid to violate the chain of command, they were unable to take advantage or to really do their jobs. Whereas the Israeli army is a lot more merit-based and a lot more egalitarian. So generally speaking, generals, if they see an opportunity, take it. The government knows that they don't always know that much about what the tactical situation is, so they give a lot of latitude to generals and officers to take advantage. They also have much better intelligence. If something's going wrong, they immediately will tell the higher up, and they'll deal with the situation. You don't have that in Arab armies. Well, another kind of issue is there's a paranoia evident. Because keep in mind, Nasser, the Syrian regime, and eventually the Iraqi regime came to power in military coups. So they were worried that there'd be another military coup. So because of that, there was often an issue where they would very much limit the power of officers under them. There was an incident in which the Syrian government would only issue rubber missiles to their jets because they were afraid of their jets attacking them. And this is kind of a recurrent theme where the army is very much hamstrung because the first priority is not having the army mutiny and overthrow the current regime. So those are just kind of a couple of the reasons why they failed so much. There's also rampant corruption, incompetence, all that kind of stuff. And just in general, whenever these wars happened, the Arabs just got trounced. The only time they had any success was during 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. And that was primarily because they did a sneak attack on the most holy Jewish day, which would kind of be like attacking attacking America on Christmas. They're just not going to be as prepared, but ultimately they got destroyed during that as well. So you have the Arab-Israeli War. The Israelis, it kind of is a bit of a slugfest, but eventually they win and they kick out a lot of, or they just willingly leave the Arab population. So now they have a pretty stable state with a Israeli majority, in which kind of things have been very much changed. See, it looks very much like modern Israel. The Golan Heights eventually get kind of occupied, and we eventually get the West Bank largely annexed by Israel in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. So then we kind of have an intermediary period between the two wars, in which we have the Jews kind of fled from the other Muslim countries, and that dramatically increased the Jewish majority within Israel. So yeah, it was, I think, roughly about 1 million Jews. You also had a Jewish exodus from Europe, from the Soviet Union. You had a lot of Jews moving from America to there. So Israel kind of became stronger and stronger. Although Israel's economy remained a basket case. It was a socialist state. There was very little free market stuff going on there. So Israel was poor and was basically on welfare from the world Jewish community, Germany, and the United States. So it was around this time, fairly soon after the Arab-Israeli War, that you started to have a stream of revolutions break out throughout the Middle East. Basically, you had the foundation of a couple different governments. I guess you could say fascism and communism kind of came late to the Arab world. When the British left, they had left a bunch of different monarchs in power in Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, etc. So you had a stream of military coups in which you had nationalist, socialist governments come to power, most notably being Nasser, but also the Ba'ath Party in both Syria and Iraq. And these were kind of a bit different than what had come before, because they were more explicitly secular, more explicitly socialist, and Arab nationalist. And this is kind of when we start to get into pan-Arabism, the idea that all the Arab people should be united in one state. And this was a goal of both the Ba'ath Party and the Nasserist movement, with Nasser kind of being seen as the de facto leader of the Arab world. However, as with anything related to the Arabs, distrust, infighting, corruption, egos and stuff kind of prevented any of this stuff from really going anywhere. We briefly had a period called the United Arab Republic and the United Arab States, where you basically had this extremely loose confederation of Egypt, Syria, and North Yemen that only lasted a couple years and more or less continually had a lot of infighting. So Nasserism is, like I said, basically socialist Arab nationalism. It's kind of a mixture of a bunch of different things. I think fascism's probably the closest thing. Baathism is definitely fascism. Because what's interesting about Baathism, it was founded by Michel Aflaq, who was a Christian, actually. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian. But he was also identified as an Arab, and he founded the Ba'ath movement. The Ba'ath movement is very explicitly fascist. I don't think they describe it that way, but they consider themselves left-wing, pan-Arab nationalism, etc. The other thing you kind of have to keep in mind whenever you're dealing with the Muslim world is the term secularism doesn't mean what it means in the West. In the West, it's kind of almost the suppression of religion as a public force. Within the Middle East, it largely means that Islam, Sharia law, is not the law of the land. The state religion is still often de facto or de jure Islam. Like Shia Islam was still the de facto, it was still the state religion of Iran, and it normally has some role in the constitution. Nasser was a practicing Muslim, so was Sadat, so was the Shah. It's more just the idea is the state's primary concern is kind of Arab identity or socialism, and it's not so like just religion is not the primary concern of the state, I guess you could say. So just when you talk about secularism, and to a certain extent, some factions of the Ba'ath Party would go a little further and kind of go more into anti-Islam, viewing it as kind of being a reactionary force. Others would kind of come up with Islamic socialism or trying to kind of mix the two together. Because I remember someone described the Iranian Revolution as having communists, Islamists, and people who were kind of sympathetic to both. And in Somalia, you would eventually have a communist Islamist government, and you'd have Islamic communism. So you kind of had all these ideas floating around, and kind of what the Arabs came to the conclusion of was if they could beat Israel, then they would be redeemed of their previous failures. If only they could defeat the Israelis, then and kind of reunite the two halves of the Arab world, because Israel's kind of a troll country dividing North Africa from the Middle East, then they could finally achieve their dream of an Arab federation. The Ba'ath Party thought it would be under Ba'ath leadership, and Nasser thought, as the leader of the largest Arab country, it would be under his leadership. But they thought that it would, that would happen. So we had a couple other things that took place in between here. Mainly we had the Suez Crisis, which I don't really know a ton about. More or less what happened was Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had previously been within Egypt but had been owned by the British and French because they paid to build it. So they joined in with Israel to take the Suez Canal back. Eventually, though, political pressure from America and the Soviet Union forced them to withdraw, and it was seen as the end of Britain's role as a superpower. And it was kind of the final nail in the coffin, and what remained of the British Empire disintegrated shortly afterwards. However, it set the stages for a rematch as it really increased Nasser's prestige. So this is now where eventually, after all my rambling, going to come in... Sorry, just a bit about the Soviet Union. Sorry, I almost forgot. So the Soviets had switched their support from the Israelis to the Arabs during this time period. Now, the main reason for this was they viewed these socialist nationalist governments as being natural allies because, they're called Arab socialist. They're like, okay, so we have these anti-Western, anti-Israel. By this point in time, Israel had been an ally of the West, if for no other reason than just out of convenience and because of, like I said, the Jewish influence within America. The Soviets were like, okay, we can win the war. We can win the Cold War in the Middle East by backing the Arabs because they're ideologically similar to us. They view the Americans and the British as being imperial powers. We've never really had overseas colonies, so they're natural allies. So they started to give money, weaponry, technical assistance to the various Arab states, and kind of became their protector. So the Middle East became kind of another proxy war. And what eventually happened, and kind of one of the causes, we get to the Six-Day War era, where Nasser is kind of, there's been a stream of setbacks in Egypt. His attempts to implement a planned economy went the way all planned economies did. The United Arab Republic didn't work out and fell apart. They were stuck in a civil war in Yemen that was going absolutely nowhere. And basically just everything was kind of a disaster. So he goes, okay, how am I going to kind of get back prestige? How am I going to become the leader of the Arab world again? We're gonna start screwing with Israel. So they closed the Straits of Tiran. So the Straits of Tiran is this little strait here between the Sinai and Saudi Arabia, which is Israel's kind of main port to Asia. So it's extremely important. It's Israel has kind of two coastal areas. Otherwise, they have to go through the Suez Canal, which is kind of a dodgy prospect. So they sealed it off, and this was kind of a posturing thing. So Nasser and the other Arab leaders started to talk about how redemption would happen when Israel was wiped off the map and the Israelis were driven into the sea. And they all started posturing. They started having military parades. They were saying, "Oh, we're gonna destroy Israel. We're gonna take them down," etc. And the great powers were kind of trying to diffuse the situation. The Soviet Union kind of felt embarrassed because they wanted to support the Arabs in this, but at the same time they were aware of their position being hypocritical because they need the Straits of Istanbul, the straits between Asia Minor and Europe, so that they can send their ships through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So they were kind of awkward about this whole thing. There was a bunch of different proposals by different great powers. None of it really went anywhere. The Arabs basically just kept moving more and more men and more material up to the border with Israel. So most of the Egyptian army was in position. The Syrians, no one really knew what was happening. After the coup, Syria became a totalitarian, paranoid police state in which no one really knew what was going on, let alone the Syrians didn't know what was going on, where you had all these internal purges, coup and counter-coup. They had become actively anti-religious. And kind of another one of the bizarre things during this time period is you have these revolutionary socialist regimes who talk about reactionaries, who talk about imperialism, and then you have Jordan, which was a conservative monarchy that had kind of a more pro-Western, pro-British approach to the whole thing, which was governed by the very popular King Hussein. So almost since he came to power, Nasser and the Syrian regime had been criticizing Hussein and calling for his overthrow and actively supporting his overthrow. So once we kind of get into this time period, he's like, oh crap, Jordan is kind of has the biggest border with Israel. They probably have the best trained army, the Arab Legion, so what are we going to do? And they almost immediately started kind of walking back and being like, oh no, Jordan, we always supported you. You're a great Arab monarchy, etc. So Jordan kind of started to get on board. You also had a bunch of other countries, including Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Kuwait, Algeria. They all sent in various expeditionary forces into the war. So another thing to keep in mind is all throughout this time period, Syria kept shelling settlements in northern Israel. So they would just fire artillery shells or missiles at these settlements and occasionally kill people. Now, there's a lot of crocodile tears that happened during and after this war, where people are like, oh, how could Israel do it? How could Israel start this war? It was a preemptive strike. Well, yeah, but in most places and times, firing artillery shells at civilian targets within a country would be viewed as a declaration of war. And I think Israel had a lot of restraint putting it off that long. So eventually what happened is Israel called for a general mobilization. So they mobilized their army, and you had the two groups kind of facing each other down. Now, there was a UN peacekeeping force within Sinai that had kind of separated the two, but Nasser kicked them out as part of his posturing. So kind of when we enter into the Six-Day War, you have Arab armies mobilized surrounding Israel. You have Nasser and the other Arab leaders giving frequent speeches about basically how they're going to invade Israel, kill everybody, etc. You have them shutting down their major ports, and kind of all this other stuff going on. So Israel basically just said, screw it. We're not going to just sit here and wait for these guys to have a chance to attack. So Israel had this huge plan, and they had everything perfectly timed. The Israelis had a much better air force. The thing to keep in mind is the Arab armies were not poorly equipped. They had the latest Soviet technology. In many cases, they were better equipped than the Israelis were. So, I mean, if we look at it right here, they had like 3 times as many combat aircraft and 3 times as many tanks as the Israelis did. They just weren't well trained, equipped, or led. So I remember one kind of story that came out when I was reading the book about the Six Day War. Israeli planes, jets could be refueled and rearmed within an hour of landing, and it took Egyptian jets like 12 to 20 hours. So Israel just decided to go for broke, and in the first half a day, they hit all the major Arab bases. They succeeded in destroying, I think it was, let me look it up, I think it was like 80 to 90% of the Egyptian Air Force. Let me just look this up. Let's see here. Preemptive air attack. Let me just go down and look at this. Yeah, so they destroy. Okay, so yeah, so Operation Focus, they basically destroyed the entire Arab Air Force within the series of a day or so. So, okay, it was actually worse than I thought it was. Okay, so the Israel destroyed 500 combat aircraft in the span of 3 hours. They also had special bombs that disabled the airfield so they couldn't even use them. And then, like, in the next 3 hours, they succeeded in blowing up Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. So, it basically, from the start, they had complete air superiority. And air superiority is very helpful, because it meant throughout the 6 days, also combined with the fact that they could refuel so quickly, whenever an Israeli commander was facing tanks or whatever, they could just call in the Israeli Air Force and just blow the crap out of it. They could just blow away entire Egyptian brigades, etc. Also, the Egyptian trenches and fortifications were much less useful against air power. So that happened. Now, the Egyptians launched an attack, and once again, you had this issue where the various divisions weren't allowed to communicate with one another. Nasser had no idea what was going on. Most of the command had no idea what was going on. They told their armies, and they broadcast on radio, the Israeli Air Force has been destroyed. We are advancing on all fronts. So Egypt attacked first, and they pretty much just got utterly annihilated due to a combination of, like I said, bad logistics, bad leadership, bad morale. So they got beat really quick during the 6 Day War. Now, like I said, the various Arab countries had no coordination with one another. So after the first day or two, Jordan joined the war, and they didn't attack at the same time Egypt did. So they came in, and then Syria came in at the end of the 6 days. So you kind of have these three countries. If they had have all attacked at the same time, they might have very well been able to beat Israel. But they didn't. They came in separately. There was no coordination between them. Now, Jordan put up a much better fight, probably because morale was a bit better. They were fighting on their own territory. Also better training. Also, it was urban environment. So the Israeli Air Force and armor was not as helpful. So that took place within Jerusalem primarily. And you had a lot of very brutal street-to-street fighting. Eventually, during the invasion of Jerusalem, we have that famous picture. Let me find it. Yeah, the Israelis succeeded in retaking the Western Wall, the only part of Herod's temple that remained. And it was the degree to which retaking all of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, the effect that it had on Israel as a nation, I think went beyond what everybody thought it would. There was a widespread belief, even among secular Jews, that this was redemption, that Israel had been redeemed, that God's long period of exile was over, and that because God had allowed them to retake this, that Israel, the Jews, were back in kind of good graces. And this would kind of lead religious Zionists over time to become more and more right-winged, and it would eventually kind of allow the right to take a dominant role in Israeli politics. So that happened, and eventually they kicked the Jordanians out across the border, and they were able to occupy all of the West Bank. Within the Golan Heights, the Israelis also launched an invasion of Syria, and the Syrian divisions just melted away. They just gave up, ran away, left their equipment behind, and they also got defeated. So, kind of throughout the war, you had the Arabs crying crocodile tears, like I said, to the UN, going, Israel attacked us. Israel was so mean. They were big meanies. we didn't do anything. We didn't start this war. Okay, we were shelling them. Okay, we moved all these soldiers to the border and said we were going to attack them, but we didn't mean it. It was just a troll. So basically, that's what they said. And throughout it, the America was trying to restrain them. It was interesting because LBJ was very pro Israel. He had given them a lot of money, a lot of support. Actually, part of the reason he had been put on the ticket was because he had really good relations with the Jews. However, he was kind of angry by this point because American Jews were constantly trying to undermine his war in Vietnam. And he's like, look, I did all this stuff for Israel. Why are you so ungrateful? And they're just like, it's just the way we are. It was kind of the approach taken. So you had all that stuff kind of happening, and the US and the USSR were trying to force Israel to a ceasefire. So what Israel did was they basically stalled for time. They're like, look, we're not going to get this good chance again. All of our enemies basically completely messed this up. There's literally no more resistance. So let's grab as much land as possible, and we can give some of it up in peace negotiations, which is what they did. So they took all of the Sinai, they took all of the Gaza Strip, they took the Golan Heights, etc. And after the war, they would eventually trade some of this land, most notably the Sinai Peninsula to Jordan in exchange for, sorry, the Sinai Peninsula. What am I talking about? To Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty. And this was kind of, it was such a disaster. Nasser attempted to resign, but there was a riot in his favor and he was convinced to stay on, despite, like I said, the complete disaster of his campaign. The Syrian regime was shaken, and Jordan was also shaken, and eventually it kind of led the Arab countries to drift out of the Soviet orbit, and they kind of began to accept Israel as existence as a given. During the Yom Kippur War, it was mentioned that the purpose of the war was to retake the Sinai. The purpose wasn't really, there was no real talk of getting rid of Israel anymore. It kind of resulted in the de facto recognition of Israel's existence. So yeah, like I said, the war ended. Israel gave back some of the territory. It kept some of it. The war had very profound impact and eventually brought Begin and Likud to power, in which they've been pretty dominant since then. You kind of had, like I said, this shift from the left holding complete power in Israel to the right holding power in Israel. So that's kind of the story of early Israel, the Six-Day War, etc. I'm sorry if I kind of rambled a bit and I didn't really go into detail about everything, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. There's a lot of kind of different stories on this, and I just kind of wanted to give you an overview and a taste. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys later.